Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the United States, the transition from one president to the next. In this case, from President 44 to President 45. It's called the interregnum. The Latin expression interregnum has always been irksome. Literally, it translates to mean between reigns, an expression that smacks of regal transition rather than the democratic passing of the baton. While the presidential inauguration is imbued with several regal traditions and the White House is a very formal structure, the United States has no history of royalty. The presidency is the closest thing to royalty, a situation that puts a wry smile on the lips of true royals. The transition, from president to president was structured in a manner that would invoke stability. Even in the event of crisis or catastrophe, even assassination, the smooth transition of power is essential. The smooth transition of power reverberates not only in the United States, but throughout the free world, or so Americans always believed. This time around, the transition hit a series of bumps in the road. It seems that the outgoing Obama administration did the best in order to make the final path to the presidency as difficult as possible for the incoming President Donald Trump. Hobbling the leader will not topple the government or destabilize the country or its influence. The anarchists once believed that assassination was the political tool that could destabilize a government. But that is simply not true for democracy at all. Even unseating a government through an election does not destabilize it. In fact, if anything, it's empowering. In this transition, the advantage was clearly on the Trump side. And yet, it seems that the Obama administration has tried to sabotage the transition, especially with regard to foreign policy. Most glaring, with regard to the Middle East. Choosing not to veto the UN resolution on settlements is just one example. Secretary of State John Kerry's farewell speech from the State Department is another example. Kerry's involvement, his mere attendance at the Paris conference, is a third clear example of how the outgoing administration was trying to exert influence beyond its tenure in the White House. Obama cast aside a long-held tradition that dictated that outgoing administrations do not engage in any far-reaching moves during their last weeks in power. The only accepted exception to the tradition is last-minute presidential pardons. This whole tradition is done in order to allow the new president a running start with which to gain momentum, forward movement in the first 100 days of the presidency, as opposed to starting off by cutting back what was just implemented by the former president. The 100 days, or the first 100 days, is another hallowed presidential tradition. It is the period during which the new president is afforded almost unfettered criticism by foes and by the media to promote the administration's goals and agenda. It's a goodwill period. The phrase was coined by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during a radio address on July 24, 1933. At the time, FDR was referring to Congress, but the term and tradition quickly extended to the presidency. President Donald Trump's first 100 days will run out on April 29th. That's the week after Passover. It was a very difficult transition, and I predict it will be a very difficult 100 days, fraught with massive conflict, challenge, and name-calling. The Tana, the great rabbinic sage, the Talmudic sage Rabbi Yishmael said, Kol hatchalot kashot, all beginnings are difficult. Like all aphorisms, there's something genuinely true and time transcendent to this Talmudic expression. January 7th marked 2 years since Charlie Hebdo. We call it Charlie Hebdo for short, but what we really mean is the horrific terror attack that was perpetrated on the satirical magazine and the Jewish supermarket in Paris. 17 innocent people were brutally murdered, and 22 others were wounded by 3 ISIS terrorists, 2 of whom were brothers. The event sent shockwaves across the Western world. The attacks struck at the very heart of Western democracy. Charlie Hebdo was a watershed. It was not the first terror attack to rock Western Europe, but it certainly had the most impact. Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, and the kosher supermarket were symbols of Western life and culture. They symbolized freedom and communal assimilation. And the attack against them was a strike against the very institutions that brought about the modern free state of France in the late 1700s in the guise of the French Revolution. The attacks were a calculated move by ISIS in an attempt to destroy that culture and that way of life. Terrorists, especially ISIS and al-Qaeda terrorists, select targets with very clear criteria. For the terrorists, it's more about the bang than it is about the sense and extent of the damage. Symbols emerge as high-priority targets because of the message that they send, not to one but two different constituencies. The first constituency is the target of the community, in this case, Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket. That would be secular, non-Muslim France and Jewish France, the Jews of France. The second constituency is all the followers, the potential followers and disciples, both silent devotees and active agents throughout the world. In that way, Charlie Hebdo was, for ISIS in Europe, as big a target as the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon was for al-Qaeda in the United States on 9/11. The attacks in Paris in January of 2015 were devastating, and yet life went back to normal. Immediacy of terror and its threats subsides. And sadly, the culture of Europe did not learn to change their defense systems because of Charlie Hebdo. And so, unfortunately, on Friday, November 13th, 2015, horror again struck in Paris, this time at the Bataclan Theater, and two other simultaneous attacks. One attack along a street lined with restaurants and their accompanying diners, and one attack in the soccer stadium. 130 innocent people were murdered, and 360 others were injured, 100 of them seriously. Again, the targets were symbols. The soccer match was an exhibition game between France and Germany, and the president of France, François Hollande, was actually in attendance. Had security not stopped the bombers, there would have been there were three of them outside the stadium where they blew themselves up. Hundreds, if not thousands of people would have been injured from the stampede alone. The Bataclan, where 89 of the innocent victims were killed, was the central target, and it was a coordinated attack. The theater was an important target for all the terrorists. The mainstream press did not seriously consider the numerous threats. Protests and publicity in the Arabic press that identified the Bataclan Theater as having been owned, though it had been sold at the time of the attack, by two very publicly Jewish brothers named Pascal and Joel Lalou. But the Arab world knew the backstory. The Lalou family used the facility as a center in which to host fundraisers for Jewish causes, including the Friends of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. The theater was known to be sympathetic to Israel. The difference between France and Europe in general, as compared to the United States, is that 9/11 changed the way the United States saw itself on the map of terror. Up until 9/11, the United States approached terror the same way France did, and sadly still after, Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan. Because of 9/11, the United States changed its entire point of view on terror. The United States recognized that it had entered into the game, albeit against its will, as a serious player and saw itself and its citizens as targets at home and while abroad. As a result, money, manpower, brainpower were all invested to fight terror and bolster the United States and do its best to keep it safe. Europe still has not quite learned these lessons, and so 2 years later, a wreath was placed and a small memorial ceremony was organized. But real changes in priorities and laws in defense are slow to arrive. And in those 2 years, more terror has struck and will continue to strike Europe. And it's not just because of immigrants from war-torn countries in the Middle East. Homegrown terrorists will come back from terror training in the Middle East. Others will never leave home, but will be activated by social media and videos shown locally in clubs and on their home computers. The only way to truly honor those who were brutally murdered is for Europe to wake up and seriously consider the threat they're under, to stand tall and confront that threat, not just with words, but with deeds. Conspiracy theories run rampant throughout the Arab Middle East. These conspiracies characteristically centered upon that which is unknown and feared. They're a big part of the character of the region. Almost each and every conspiracy theory has believers attributing super strength, superpower, even superhuman traits to groups and people and to individuals. Not surprisingly, the end result is an altered state of reality. It is that heightened sense of fear that paralyzes locals throughout the Middle East and allowed terrorist groups, most notably ISIS and Al-Qaeda, to bring huge swaths of the region into submission. It's a vicious cycle of fear, submission, conspiracy theory, and finally, hyperbole. That explains what appears irrational to the rational mind. Conspiracies have spread about superhuman warriors, the equivalent of Iraqi Rambo-like characters fighting ISIS, and Syrian Iron Men-like thugs battling their respective enemies. There are claims that these men have killed dozens and even hundreds of ISIS fighters. Photos have been digitally enhanced and morphed to make the hero warriors resemble Superman or the Hulk. For decades, this warped sense of perspective has portrayed Israel in unrealistic ways also, and continued a misconception is one of the difficulties facing those who hope to achieve normal interaction, let alone peace between Israel and her neighbors. The seeds of hatred are deep, and the conspiracy theories will not abate unless leaders, educators, and clergy diligently work to dispel them. Israel is seen as a mass murderer and a torturer of Arabs. This is the prevailing perception throughout the Middle East and the Muslim worlds. Israel is viewed not only merely as a land grabber, but as a desecrator of Arab and Muslim lands, the holy places. Israel is portrayed as an oppressor of the innocent. And so, anyone, read terrorist, who acts against Israel is doing so in what can only be determined by them as self-defense. Compound that with the conspiracy theorist perception of Israelis being superhuman fighters, masters in sci-fi technology, and creators of weapons with superpower abilities, and a true picture of reality, or rather, the altered reality that the Israeli-Palestinian situation emerges. The theory goes on to explain that Israel's weapons arsenal can go anywhere and sees and hears everything. Preposterous as it sounds, these theories have taken on such an exaggerated life of their own that parts of the Muslim and Arab world have taken to torturing and executing birds that they are convinced are Israeli spies. Truth is, Israel is a bird-watching superpower. Practically speaking, Israel is one of the most advanced countries when it comes to tracking birds. It's the haven for birds. Ornithologists from all over the world come to Israel, especially southern Israel, to watch bird migration. Birds make their way straight up the Syrian-African Rift to the Beit Shan Valley, and then on to the Chulab Valley in the Galilee. It's got nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with diplomacy or security issues. It's all about geography. Israel is situated between Africa and Europe. It's on the migration route of 500 million birds. Over 530 species travel in splendor and in meticulous formation from Africa to Europe and then back. Many flocks of birds touch down in southern Israel today, just as their ancestors did in biblical times. They follow the same migration path. They fly the same formation. It is truly breathtaking to watch. But conspiracy devotees are not easily turned into ornithologist devotees. Not too long ago, a bird with an Israeli tag was arrested for espionage. The bird was thought to be a spy. It was thought to be carrying cameras and microchips, and perhaps even explosives. After an investigation, which included an X-ray, this bird, like others, was set free to fly away. Another bird, one that had a metal ring tag on its leg which read 24311 Tel Avivunia, Israel, was spotted in Turkey. Of course, that would frighten any reasonable person, who would then frantically call the police and then the secret police service. This particular bird was found and captured in the Ejin district in eastern province of Elazig. The incident was reported in the national Turkish newspaper Hurriyet, usually a reliable source. In this case, at least, Hurriyet maintained a sense of humor and concluded their piece with the following sentence. Following the test, the authorities decided not to press official charges, and the falsely accused bird was free to fly away. Not just birds. Several years ago, the Egyptians saw an increase in shark attacks and blamed it on Israel. They asserted that Israeli-trained sharks were attacking Egyptians and tourists, of course. In contrast, when an Iranian bird touched down in Israel, it was well received. The Iranian white-throat robin and Iranian gutturalus is very rare and indigenous only to Iran. It does migrate, but only very rarely to Israel. That explains why this robin is an endangered bird in Israel, even though it's plentiful in Iran itself. The bird was spotted and photographed in a children's park in Israel's southernmost city, Eilat. The Iranian was hopping and playing and enjoying himself. A photographer quickly shot a photo, not a weapon, and sent it to the local birdwatching center to confirm its accuracy. Conspiracy theories about Israel, crazy as many of them sound, are as much a part of the large swaths of Muslim and Arab culture as are hummus and pita. These ideas are part of the inner essence of their culture. In order to move forward, these theories need to be debunked and these myths need to be demystified. Coming up, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. I'm only going to discuss one column today. It comes from the Sunday Review of the New York Times and was published in print on January 15th and online on January 14th. It is entitled The Linguistic Labyrinth of Arabic News. The author is Ben Hubbard. Hubbard is one of the New York Times Mideast correspondents. His thesis is something that I've been saying for a long time, but it is also has its own partner in the United States media. The basic idea is that the Arabic media and their viewers use very different terms for the same events and people. A terrorist can easily be a martyr, etc. This is how Hubbard begins. Dateline, Beirut, Lebanon. As the Syrian government took back eastern Aleppo from the rebels in December, the story you heard in the Arab world about what was happening largely depended on where you got your news. On some channels, it was a heroic tale of the Syrian army cleansing the area of armed groups or terrorists before leading a process of reconciliation. On others, the regime had routed the revolutionaries and planned to carry out ethnic cleansing against the Syrian people. Such drastically different narratives of the same event are prominent features of the media landscape in the Arab world, a reality that I had to learn to navigate during a decade living and working here as a journalist. Hubbard knows full well that there is no such thing as impartial press in that part of the world. He realizes the Orwellian experience. All the terror groups have their own TV and radio and internet news services. And of course, so too do the various Middle East countries. Hubbard continues, far from being independent brokers of information, these channels have powerful backers who deploy them to bolster their agendas and undermine their foes. What that means for the viewer, for the student of Arabic, is having to decipher a complex code of politically charged vocabulary whose usage can swiftly betray someone's political views. Who are the martyrs in Syria, for example? The government soldiers killed by the rebels, or the rebels killed by the government? Who's the resistance? Hezbollah and other groups committed to the destruction of Israel, or militias fighting for the exiled government in Yemen? Hubbard describes that when learning Arabic, he discovered that the same event was being called different things by different people. Hubbard writes, I learned that the suicide attack and the martyrdom operation were the same thing, but from different points of view. Hubbard concludes with further examples proving his point. I now know that you have to be careful what you call a regime, and that in the aftermath of an attack, you don't ask how many people died. You ask about the number of martyrs, unless you're talking about the enemy. And I keep learning. During a recent trip to Yemen, I asked a rebel fighter what his group called it when they had stormed out of the mountains and pushed the government into exile. Saudi Arabia called it a coup d'etat. We call it the revolution, he said, smiling. Ben Hubbard is stating the obvious. Where he's sadly missing the point is that the New York Times does the same thing. His own paper is guilty of the same propaganda when it comes to Israel. They do it so as not to insult and in the guise of being even-handed. Instead, they refuse to call them terrorists when they attack Israelis and Jews. The result is that the Times seems to be justifying the terror by not calling it terror. The New York Times almost never calls those who murder Israelis terrorists. They are called many things. They're called fighters and martyrs, members of the resistance. They are called soldiers. They are called many names from even reactionaries, but they are not called murderers or mass murderers. And that is a problem on our side. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. This first cartoon is a pictoon, a picture with a caption, and was published in Powerline blog on December 31st, 2016. The Pictoon makes fun of the United Nations Security Council resolution that the United States did not veto about Israel and her settlement policy. The picture is of the United Nations building, and the caption reads, "Mr. Trump, dismantle this illegal settlement." This next cartoon is by Branco and is from his Legal Insurrection website. It was originally published in 2014 and is making its rounds again now. Seated around the table, it's a negotiation table, is Netanyahu, Kerry, and Hamas. Hamas is holding a list of demands and a baby with a suicide belt. These demands read, "Death to all Jews in blood red ink." So Kerry says to Netanyahu, "Could you please at least meet him halfway?" Sad, but unfortunately very true. Next up is a cartoon from the International New York Times, published on January 2nd, 2017, and is drawn by Patrick Chapate. It's called "The Year of Putin," and it pokes fun at Trump and Putin. Putin is wearing a Russian hat that reads, "Made Russia Great Again," with "sort of" in parentheses. In the background is a general looking at a map of Syria, and the general supervising hackers sitting in front of computer screens. Last up is also by Patrick Chapate, but not from the International New York Times. It was published in the NZZ AM Sonntag and published on October 23rd, 2016. It's entitled "The Samsung Effect." There are two panels in the cartoon. On the left is a stick of dynamite with a fuse, and the panel is called "Regular Explosive." The panel on the right is a Samsung phone, and the panel reads "Cordless." It's a play on the Samsung 7 that has been banned on all planes, and anyone who has flown recently has heard the announcement about banning the Samsung 7. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. News reports flooding the internet are telling us that Russia is pulling out of Syria. Not true. They're actually expanding their air bases and deepening the water in their naval base in Tartus. The headlines are exciting and they're entertaining, but they are not true. All that's happening is that Russia is sending back its only aircraft carrier to its home port, and that's hardly a pullout. The aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, just arrived in the region in mid-October, where it dropped anchor just outside the Syrian port of Tartus. The conflict in Syria began a full 6 years ago. This was not the first, nor the second, nor even the third trip of the Russian aircraft carrier to the Syrian shoreline. Russia's aircraft carrier comes and goes all the time when it has a particular role to play. It's dispatched only to leave when the role has been completed. Remember, the Russians have only one vessel of this caliber. The Admiral Kuznetsov, the aircraft carrier, is not like the U.S. carriers. U.S. carriers are there to preserve peace on the open seas and peacekeeping purposes in general. The Russians use their carrier as an offensive weapon that's integrated into its ground and air strategy. This carrier is equipped with 35 jets and 26 standard helicopters. Of those, 18 are attack helicopters. There is no doubt that those planes played an important role in giving cover to Assad's forces and impounding ISIS and Syrian rebel forces. There are still 2 Russian Air Force bases in Syria. According to the best intel we have, each of the bases houses 20 fighter jets and 15 helicopters. That alone indicates that Russia still has a very strong Air Force presence above Syria. Remember, in March when Russia announced that they were pulling out of Syria, that really meant that they were just reorganizing. So too now. Russia is not leaving, not withdrawing. They're not abandoning the area entirely or pulling out. 70 jets and helicopters is more than enough military might to continue their job after the aircraft carrier departs. And that's not all. Russia has 2 French Mistral helicopter carriers that have been positioned outside of Tartus for the past few months. These Mistral carriers are much smaller than the aircraft carrier. They are designed specifically to be a launch pad for attacking ground targets, and each of the helicopter carriers holds 35 helicopter gunships. The history of the arrival of these French military weapons in Syria remains a mystery. Russia commissioned the helicopter carriers at about $1 billion each from France, but they couldn't take delivery because of an arms embargo placed on Russia after their invasion of Crimea. Instead, the carriers were sold to Egypt in a gift package financed by the Saudis. That happened in September with a great fanfare in Egypt. And then they simply disappeared, only to appear a few days later as Russia's 2 brand new Mistral helicopter carriers sitting off the coast of Tartus. Russia didn't end around the arms embargo, all to come to Syria's aid. And they built not one, but 2 Air Force bases there, numerous land bases, including a $3.5 billion naval port in Tartus, which Russia uses as their command and control center for the entire Middle East. From there, they can see and hear and reach everything and everyone in the region. So the answer is no. Russia is not pulling out of Syria. They have way too much invested in Syria to pull out now. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that conspiracy comes from the Latin? Most dictionaries say the etymology comes from Old English or Old French, which is true, but Latin before that. It's a compound Latin word. Com, or in this case, con, means with, and spiro, or spirio, means to breathe, a breath, similar to the root of spirit, let's say, for instance. The essence of the word conspiracy is that all involved are in this one single breath together, in unison. They are of one spirit working together to subvert a cause. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.